He was a millionaire who hadn't touched a woman in 18 years, until I, his assistant, did something unexpected. I never thought he'd fall madly in love with me. My name is Brynn Carlisle, and if someone had told me 3 years ago that I'd end up falling in love with the most powerful and mysterious businessman in the United States, I would have laughed in their face. Back then, I was just another face in the crowd, a 25-year-old orphan from Cleveland with big dreams and an even bigger hole in her heart where a family should have been. I grew up at St. Mary's Children's Home, a red brick building that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. Don't get me wrong, the nuns were kind enough and I had a roof over my head when so many others didn't. But there's something about not knowing where you come from that eats at you from the inside out. It's like trying to solve a puzzle when half the pieces are missing. The only clue to my past was a delicate silver medallion I wore around my neck, the one thing that came with me when I was left at the orphanate as a baby. It was simple but elegant, with the initials CD engraved in beautiful script on the back. I used to trace those letters with my finger for hours, wondering who CD was and why they'd given me this precious piece of jewelry before abandoning me forever. As a kid, I'd make up stories about those initials. Maybe CID was my mother, Catherine Diane, or Christina Dawn, and she was a princess who had to give me up to save the kingdom. Or maybe she was a famous actress who couldn't handle the scandal of having a child out of wedlock. The stories changed, but the ache in my chest never did. By the time I turned 18 and aged out of the system, I'd developed a thick skin and an iron will. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through community college, then transferred to Ohio State on a partial scholarship. Business administration wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. I figured if I couldn't find my family, at least I could build a life that would make them proud, wherever they were. After graduation, I spent 2 years working dead-end office jobs in Cleveland. Saving every penny I could, my dream was always New York City, the place where people like me, people with nothing but determination, could reinvent themselves. When I finally had enough saved for a one-way ticket and a month's rent on a shoebox apartment in Queens, I knew it was time. That's how I ended up sitting in the pristine waiting room of Blackwood Enterprises on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. Clutching my resume and trying not to let my nerves show, the job posting had been simple. Personal assistant to CEO, discretion required, exceptional compensation for the right candidate. I'd researched Thorne Blackwood obsessively before the interview. 45 years old, self-made billionaire, owner of one of the largest financial empires in the country. But what struck me most wasn't his success. It was what wasn't there. No social media presence, no photos at charity galas with beautiful women on his arm, no mentions of family or personal life whatsoever. The man was a ghost in his own story. The rumors about him started the moment I walked through those glass doors. The other assistants and junior executives would whisper in the break room, their voices dropping to hushed tones whenever his name came up. He hasn't been seen with a woman in 18 years, one secretary told me on my first day. Not once. People say something terrible happened to him, something that turned his heart to ice. I heard he was married once, another chimed in, but she died in some tragic accident. He's never gotten over it. My cousin works at his penthouse building, a third woman added, leaning in conspiratorially. The doorman told her that Mr. Blackwood sometimes screams in his sleep. Nightmares, whatever happened to him must have been awful. I tried to dismiss the gossip as just that, gossip, but as the weeks turned into months, I began to see what they meant. Thorne Blackwood was brilliant, demanding, and absolutely untouchable. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper, but there was something cold and unreachable about him, like he was living his life from behind bulletproof glass. He treated me with professional courtesy, nothing more. Our interactions were limited to work. Schedule this meeting. Cancel that appointment. Draft this proposal. He never asked about my weekend plans or made small talk about the weather. If I brought him coffee, he'd nod his thanks without looking up from his computer screen. If I had questions about a project, he'd answer them with clinical precision, then immediately return to whatever he was working on. But sometimes, just sometimes, I'd catch him staring out his office window with this look of profound sadness that made my chest tighten. In those moments, he didn't look like the ruthless businessman everyone feared. He looked like a man carrying a weight so heavy it might crush him. I found myself wondering what had broken him so completely. What kind of tragedy could turn someone so successful, so powerful, into a man who seemed to be just going through the motions of living. And why did I care so much about someone who barely acknowledged my existence? The answer to that last question scared me more than I wanted to admit, because somewhere between organizing his calendar and fielding his phone calls, I'd started to see glimpses of the man behind the mask. The way his jaw would tighten when he thought no one was looking. The way he'd unconsciously touch his chest, right over his heart, when he thought he was alone. The way he'd sometimes say, "Thank you," with just a hint of warmth that made me think the ice around his heart wasn't as thick as everyone believed. I was falling for a man who'd built walls so high that nobody could reach him. A man who'd sworn off love so completely that my very presence in his life was purely transactional. A man whose secrets ran so deep that I'd probably never understand what had made him this way. But fate, as I was about to discover, had other plans for both of us. That night started like any other, or so I thought. It was a Thursday in late October, and I'd stayed late to finish preparing materials for Thorne's early morning board meeting. The Blackwood Enterprises building was eerily quiet after hours, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below keeping me company. I should have gone home hours earlier, but something about the way Thorne had been acting all week nagged at me. He'd seemed more distant than usual, if that was even possible. His already minimal conversations had become practically non-existent, and I'd caught him staring at his computer screen for long stretches without actually working. There were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping well, and he'd been drinking more coffee than humanly healthy. As his assistant, I told myself I was just being observant, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I cared about him, even though caring about Thorne Blackwood was like trying to hug a glacier. Cold, impossible, and likely to leave you numb. Around 11 p.m., I finally finished organizing the presentation materials and decided to drop them off at his office before heading home. I figured he'd already left. He usually did by 9, but his office light was still on, spilling yellow warmth into the darkened hallway. I knocked softly on his door, but there was no answer. "Mr. Blackwood," I called out, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. That's when I saw him. Thorne was slumped over his desk, his usually perfect dark hair disheveled, his expensive suit jacket crumpled on the floor. Even from the doorway, I could see that something was terribly wrong. His skin looked flushed and sweaty, and his breathing was shallow and labored. "Oh my God," I whispered, rushing to his side. When I touched his forehead, my heart nearly stopped. He was burning up with fever, his skin so hot it scared me. "Mr. Blackwood, Thorne." I shook his shoulder gently, and his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Brynn," he mumbled, his voice rough and confused. What are you doing here?" "You're sick," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Really sick. We need to get you to a hospital." He tried to sit up straighter, but swayed dangerously. "No hospitals," he said firmly, though the effect was somewhat diminished by the fact that he could barely keep his eyes open. Just need to sleep." "You need medical attention," I insisted, but he shook his head weakly. "No doctors, please." There was something in his voice. Not just stubbornness, but genuine fear, like the idea of being vulnerable in front of strangers, terrified him more than whatever illness was ravaging his body. Looking back, I should have called 911 anyway, should have overruled his protests and gotten him proper medical care. But in that moment, seeing him so completely defenseless for the first time since I'd known him, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. "Okay," I said softly. "No hospital, but I'm not leaving you alone like this." I helped him to the leather couch in his office, which was more comfortable than the desk chair. He was so weak that he had to lean heavily on me, and I was struck by how solid and warm he felt against my side, how human he seemed when stripped of his usual commanding presence. I loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, then went to his private bathroom to get cool, damp towels for his forehead. I found a bottle of fever reducer in his desk drawer, probably left over from some previous illness, and coaxed him into taking 2 pills with small sips of water. "You don't have to stay," he said weakly as I settled into the chair beside the couch. "I'll be fine." "Sure you will," I replied, not bothering to hide my skepticism. "Just like you were fine when I found you passed out at your desk." He didn't have the energy to argue, which told me exactly how sick he really was. Thorne Blackwood never backed down from anything, But fever and exhaustion had stripped away his defenses, leaving him as vulnerable as anyone else. For the next few hours, I took care of him like he was family. I monitored his temperature, replaced the cool cloths on his forehead when they got warm, and made sure he stayed hydrated when he shivered despite the fever. I found a blanket in his office closet and tucked it around him carefully, but it was around 3 a.m. that everything changed. The fever had broken temporarily, and Thorn had fallen into what seemed like a peaceful sleep. I was dozing in the chair beside him when I heard him start to mumble. At first, I thought he was just talking in his sleep, but then his voice became more agitated. "No," he whispered, his head turning restlessly on the couch cushion. "Celeste, please don't go. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." My heart clenched at the raw pain in his voice. Even unconscious, even sick, he was being tortured by whatever had happened to him. "It's my fault," he continued, his voice breaking. "All my fault. She was pregnant. Our baby. I killed them both." Tears started rolling down his cheeks, and without thinking, I reached out and took his hand. It was large and warm, with calluses that spoke of a life that hadn't always been lived behind a desk. "Shh," I whispered, squeezing his fingers gently. "It's okay. You're safe." His grip tightened on my hand like I was an anchor in a storm. "Celeste," he breathed, and the anguish in that single word made my chest ache. I loved her so much. I destroyed everything. I stayed there beside him, holding his hand and whispering meaningless words of comfort while he fought demons in his sleep. In those dark hours before dawn, I learned more about Thorn Blackwood than I had in 6 months of working for him. I learned that beneath his icy exterior was a man consumed by guilt and grief. A man who blamed himself for losing someone named Celeste and their unborn child. When morning finally came and the fever broke for good, Thorn woke up slowly, blinking in the pale sunlight streaming through his office windows. For a moment, he looked confused, like he couldn't quite remember where he was or why I was there. Then his gaze dropped to our joined hands, and something shifted in his expression. Not embarrassment, exactly, but a kind of wonder, like he couldn't quite believe that someone had stayed with him through his darkest hours. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice still hoarse but steadier than it had been all night. "You don't need to thank me," I replied, suddenly self-conscious about the intimacy of the moment. But he didn't let go of my hand right away, and when he looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since I'd started working for him, I saw something in his dark eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition, maybe, or possibility. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "Yes, I did," I answered honestly. "I couldn't leave you alone." Something in his expression softened then, just a fraction, but enough to give me hope that maybe, just maybe, the walls around his heart weren't as impenetrable as everyone thought. The days following that night felt like I was living in a completely different world. It's funny how one moment of vulnerability can shatter years of carefully constructed walls, isn't it? Because that's exactly what happened between Thorn and me. Everything changed, even though neither of us was ready to admit it out loud. The morning after I'd taken care of him, Thorn had insisted on going home to recover properly. I'd wanted to argue, to tell him he needed more rest, but the professional mask was already sliding back into place. Still, when he thanked me again before leaving, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a warmth that made my stomach flutter in ways I definitely shouldn't have been feeling about my boss. When he returned to work 3 days later, I expected things to go back to normal. I thought we'd slip back into our usual pattern of polite, distant professionalism. God, was I wrong? It started with small things. Instead of his usual curt nod when I brought him his morning coffee, he'd actually look up and say, "Good morning, Brynn. How are you today?" The first time it happened, I nearly dropped the cup, Thorn Blackwood asking about my well-being. It was like discovering your refrigerator could suddenly speak French. Then there were the conversations that began to stretch beyond work, when I'd brief him on his schedule. He'd ask follow-up questions that had nothing to do with business. "You mentioned you're from Cleveland. Do you miss it?" Or, "Have you had a chance to explore much of the city yet?" Simple questions, but coming from him, they felt monumental. The biggest change, though, was in the way he looked at me. Before that night, I'd been invisible to him, just another piece of office equipment that happened to schedule his meetings and answer his phones. But now, When I'd catch him watching me across the office, there was an intensity in his gaze that made my breath catch, like he was seeing me for the first time. I found myself looking forward to work in a way that probably wasn't healthy. I'd wake up thinking about what I might wear, wondering if he'd smile at me the way he'd started doing when I'd make a joke about his impossible schedule. I'd catch myself staying late, hoping he might need something that would give us an excuse to talk. It was during one of those late evenings, about 2 weeks after the fever incident, that everything shifted again. I was finishing up some correspondence when Thorne emerged from his office, loosening his tie. "Brynn, you should go home. It's past 8. "Just finishing these letters," I said, not looking up from my computer. "I'll be done in a few minutes." Instead of just nodding and leaving like he used to, he walked over to my desk. "What letters are so important they can't wait until tomorrow?" I explained about the time-sensitive investor communications, and he frowned. "You shouldn't be handling those alone. They're more complex than I realized." "I can manage," I said, maybe a little defensively. "I'm sure you can," he replied, and then surprised me by pulling up a chair beside my desk. "But let me help. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. For the next hour, we worked side by side, our heads bent over the documents, our shoulders occasionally brushing as we reached for papers. I was hyper-aware of everything about him. The way he smelled like expensive cologne and something uniquely him. The way his brow furrowed when he concentrated. The way his voice got softer when he was explaining something complex. "You're incredibly good at this," he said as we finished the last letter. "I had no idea you had such a strong grasp of financial communications." "I studied business in college," I admitted. "I've always been interested in how companies really work, not just the surface stuff." He turned to look at me then, and we were sitting so close I could see flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "There's a lot more to you than I realized, isn't there, Brynn?" My heart started pounding. I could say the same about you. The air between us seemed to shimmer with tension. I knew I should look away, should make some excuse to leave, should do anything to break the spell that was weaving itself around us. But I couldn't move. Neither could he. "Brynn," he said softly, and my name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before, like a prayer or a confession. "Yes." He reached up slowly, so slowly I could have stopped him if I wanted to, and brushed a strand of hair back from my face. His fingers lingered against my cheek, warm and gentle, and I found myself leaning into his touch. "I should apologize," he whispered. "For what?" "For what I'm about to do." And then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate, hungry, like he'd been holding back for weeks and finally couldn't anymore. His hands cupped my face as his lips moved against mine, and I felt like every nerve ending in my body had suddenly come alive. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "This is insane," he said, but he didn't let go of me. "Completely," I agreed, but I didn't pull away either. "I'm your boss. I know. This could ruin everything. I know that too." He looked at me for a long moment, conflict clear in his expression. I don't do this, Brynn. I don't get involved with anyone. I can't." "Why not?" Pain flashed across his features. "Because I destroy everything I touch. Everyone I've ever loved has gotten hurt because of me." "That's not true," I said, though I didn't really know his story yet. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," I interrupted. "Tell me what happened. Tell me about Celeste." He went very still at the mention of her name. "How do you talked about her when you were sick. You were having nightmares." For a moment I thought he might actually open up to me, but then the shutters came down over his expression, and he stood up abruptly. "I should drive you home," he said, his voice carefully neutral again. "Thorne, please let me drive you home." The ride to my apartment was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. There was something simmering between us now, an acknowledgement of what had just happened, and what it might mean. When he walked me to my door, he caught my hand. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted quietly. "Neither do I said. "But maybe that's okay." He squeezed my fingers gently. "Good night, Brynn." "Good night." After that night, our relationship became this delicate dance of professional boundaries and personal attraction. We'd have perfectly normal work conversations, but our eyes would linger a beat too long. He'd hand me documents and our fingers would brush, sending little sparks up my arm. We'd find excuses to work late together, our conversations becoming more personal, more intimate. 3 weeks later, he kissed me again in the elevator after everyone else had gone home. 2 days after that, he took me to dinner at a quiet restaurant where no one from the office would see us. A week later, I found myself in his penthouse apartment, finally understanding what it meant to feel complete. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. I was in love with a man who saw me, really saw me, in a way no one ever had before. A man who made me feel like I was worth something, like I mattered. I should have known it was too good to last. For 3 months, I lived in what I can only describe as a beautiful dream. Thorn and I had found our rhythm, professional during office hours, but completely different when we were alone. Our relationship was still a secret from everyone at Blackwood Enterprises. But in the quiet moments we stole together, I felt like I'd finally found where I belonged. He was nothing like the cold, distant man everyone thought they knew when it was just us. Thorn was gentle, thoughtful, and surprisingly vulnerable. He'd tell me stories about building his business from nothing, about the long nights and impossible decisions that had shaped him into the man he'd become. In return, I'd share my own stories, about growing up in the orphanage, about my dreams of finding my family, about the loneliness that had followed me my entire life until I met him. But there were still shadows in his past that he wouldn't let me into. Whenever I'd ask about Celeste, or about the nightmares I'd witnessed that fevered night, he'd deflect or change the subject entirely. I could see the pain in his eyes. But he kept those wounds locked away from me, and I loved him enough not to push. I should have pushed. It was a Tuesday morning in February when everything came crashing down. I remember it so clearly because it had been snowing the night before, and the city looked like something out of a fairy tale. I'd been in an unusually good mood, humming as I organized Thorn's schedule for the day. I was reaching into my purse for my phone when my medallion, the one piece of my past that I'd carried with me my entire life, caught on the strap and came loose. It tumbled out onto my desk with a soft clink. Catching the morning sunlight streaming through the office windows, that's when Thorn emerged from his office, coffee cup in hand, probably coming to discuss the morning's meetings. He was mid-sentence about some investor call when his eyes landed on the medallion sitting on my desk. I've never seen anyone's face change so dramatically, so completely, in such a short span of time. The color drained from his skin like someone had opened a faucet. His coffee cup slipped from his fingers, crashing to the floor and shattering, sending hot liquid and ceramic shards everywhere. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his voice so rough and strange that I barely recognized it. I looked down at the medallion, confused by his reaction. I've had it my whole life. It was with me when I was left at the orphanage." Thorn moved closer, his steps unsteady, like he was walking through a nightmare. He reached out with a shaking hand and picked up the medallion, turning it over to reveal the initials engraved on the back. "Celeste Dalton," he breathed, and the words hit me like a physical blow. This medallion, it was the last gift I gave to my wife. The world seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the edge of my desk, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "That's impossible. This has been mine since you were born," he finished, his voice hollow. "Oh God, oh my God." The truth hit both of us at the same moment, and it was devastating. "You're her daughter," he said, sinking into the chair across from my desk like his legs could no longer support him. "You're Celeste's daughter, the baby we thought we lost." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what this meant. "No," I whispered. "No, that can't be right." But even as I said it, I knew it was true. The medallion, the initials CED, the fact that I'd been left at an orphanage as a newborn, it all fit together like pieces of a horrible puzzle. "Celeste was pregnant when she died," Thorn continued, his voice barely audible. 6 months along, the doctors said. They said they couldn't save the baby, that you died with her. But I didn't die, I said stupidly, because I couldn't think of anything else to say. "No," he agreed, looking at me with such anguish that I wanted to reach out and comfort him. But I couldn't move. "You didn't die. You survived. You're here. I'm what?" I asked, though I was terrified of the answer. He met my eyes, and I saw my own horror reflected back at me. "You're my stepdaughter, Brynn. Celeste and I were married when you were born. Technically, legally. You're my daughter, The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Everything we'd built together, every moment of happiness we'd shared, every dream we'd dared to have about a future, it all crumbled to dust in an instant. I thought I might throw up, or faint, or both. "This can't be happening," I said, standing up so abruptly that my chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "This isn't real. This is some kind of sick joke." But Thorne's devastated expression told me it was anything but a joke. "I loved her so much," he said, his voice breaking. "Celeste was everything to me. And you, God, Brynn, what have we done? What have I done?" The full horror of our situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. I'd fallen in love with my dead mother's husband. I'd been intimate with the man who should have been my father figure. Everything between us was wrong, twisted, impossible. "I need to go," I said, grabbing my purse with shaking hands. "Brynn, wait. No." I turned on him, fury and pain and disgust warring in my chest. "Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me again. Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" I screamed, not caring that the entire office could probably hear me. "Explain how you've been sleeping with your dead wife's daughter. Explain how neither of us knew we were committing some kind of incest." The word hung between us like a curse. Thorne flinched as if I'd slapped him. "I didn't know," he said desperately. "I swear to God, I had no idea who you were." "It doesn't matter." I was crying now, ugly sobs that tore at my throat. "It doesn't matter that we didn't know. It's still wrong. It's still sick. We're still—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say out loud what we were to each other. "I need to know about her," I said finally, wiping my face with the back of my hand. "I need to know about my mother, about what happened to her. Brynn, tell me." So he did. Through his own tears, Thorne told me about Celeste Dalton, the woman who'd given birth to me and died in the process. He told me about their marriage, about his obsession with work that had driven a wedge between them. He told me about the fight they'd had the night she died, about how she'd stormed out of their house in a rage and driven straight into a tree on the rain-slicked highway. "It was my fault," he said when he finished. "All of it. If I hadn't been so jealous, so controlling, she never would have left that night. She'd still be alive, and you'd have grown up with your mother instead of in an orphanage. You killed her," I said numbly. "Yes. And now you've—" I couldn't say it, couldn't voice what we'd done to each other. "I've destroyed you too," he finished, "just like I destroy everything I touch." I stared at the man I'd thought I loved, trying to reconcile this broken, guilt-ridden stranger with the person who'd made me feel whole for the first time in my life, but I couldn't. The Thorne I'd fallen for was gone, replaced by this tortured soul who saw me not as the woman he loved, but as the daughter of the woman he'd killed. "I have to go," I said again. This time, he didn't try to stop me. I walked out of Blackwood Enterprises that day knowing I could never come back. Not as his employee, and certainly not as his lover. Whatever we'd had between us was over, poisoned by a truth too horrible to survive. The week after discovering the truth about my identity was the darkest period of my entire life. I'd called in sick to work, which was a joke since I couldn't imagine ever setting foot in that building again, and spent most of my time curled up in my tiny Queens apartment, staring at the medallion that had destroyed everything. I must have picked it up 1,000 times, tracing those initials with my finger the way I had as a child. But now they didn't represent hope or mystery. They represented a truth so devastating that I wished I'd never learned it. Celeste Dalton. My mother, the woman whose husband I'd fallen in love with by the 3rd day. I knew I couldn't keep hiding from reality. I needed answers, real answers, about who my mother was and what had really happened the night she died. If I was going to live with this nightmare, I had to understand it completely. Thorne had been calling and texting nonstop, but I ignored every attempt at contact. I wasn't ready to face him. Wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. But I needed information that only he could provide, so I finally sent him a single text. "I need to know everything about her. Meet me at Central Park, near the reservoir. 1 hour. When I arrived at our meeting spot, Thorne was already there, sitting on a bench and looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled. Wrinkled shirt, unshaven face, eyes red-rimmed from what I assumed was the same lack of sleep I'd been experiencing. "Thank you for coming," he said softly as I sat down beside him. careful to keep distance between us. "Just tell me about her," I said without preamble. "Tell me about Celeste." He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "She was beautiful," he began. "Not just physically, though she was stunning. She had this inner light that drew people to her. When she walked into a room, everyone noticed. But she was never arrogant about it. She was kind, generous, always thinking about others before herself. I tried to picture this woman, my mother, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. We met at a charity gala when she was 24, Thorne continued. I was 31 and completely focused on building my business. I'd never been serious about anyone. But Celeste, she changed everything. Within 6 months, I knew I wanted to marry her. "How long were you married?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. 3 years. His hands clenched into fists in his lap. 3 years that should have been the happiest of my life. But I was too stupid and selfish to appreciate what I had. "What do you mean?" He turned to look at me then, and the pain in his eyes was almost unbearable. I was obsessed with work, with proving myself, with building an empire. I thought I was doing it for us, for our future. But really, I was just feeding my own ego. Celeste tried to tell me that she needed more from me, more of my time and attention. But I didn't listen. The picture he was painting made my chest ache. My mother, trying to connect with a husband who was too busy to see her. "She wanted children so badly," Thorne whispered. "We'd been trying for 2 years when she finally got pregnant with you. She was so happy, Brynn, so excited. She'd already started planning the nursery, picking out names, talking about all the things she wanted to teach you." Tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't wipe them away. This was the first time I'd ever heard anything about my mother's hopes and dreams for me. "What happened?" I asked. "What was the fight about that last night?" Thorne's face crumpled. I'd been working late again. Some merger that seemed so important at the time. I came home around 11, and Celeste was waiting for me. She was 6 months pregnant, beautiful and glowing, and she just wanted to spend time with her husband. He paused, struggling with the memory, but I was stressed about the deal. And when she asked me to come to bed, to forget about work for one night, I snapped at her. I said horrible things about how she didn't understand the pressure I was under, how she was being selfish, expecting me to drop everything just because she was bored. "Oh, Thorne," I breathed. She started crying. And God help me, I made it worse. I accused her of being hormonal, of trying to sabotage my career out of jealousy. I said she was acting like a child who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. The pain in his voice was raw, devastating. "She looked at me like I was a stranger," he continued. "Like she couldn't believe the man she'd married could be so cruel. And then she said something that I'll never forget. 'I don't even know who you are anymore, Thorne. The man I fell in love with would never treat me like this. What did you do?' I doubled down, told her she was being dramatic, that she'd understand when she grew up a little, and then," he choked on the words, "then she grabbed her keys and said she was going to her sister's house until I came to my senses." The rest of the story unfolded like a horror movie. Celeste, upset and crying, driving through a thunderstorm, the rain-slicked roads, the curve she'd taken 1,000 times before, but couldn't navigate safely in her emotional state. "The police said she died on impact," Thorne said numbly. "The doctors managed to perform an emergency C-section, but they told me the baby didn't make it either. They said you were born sleeping, that there was nothing they could do. But that was a lie," I said. "Apparently," he looked at me with wonder and grief warring in his expression. "You survived, Brynn. Somehow, you survived. And someone made the decision to tell me you hadn't. Why would they do that? I don't know. Maybe they thought it would be easier for me to grieve both losses at once, rather than trying to raise a daughter alone while dealing with the guilt of Celeste's death. Maybe there were legal complications I wasn't told about, or maybe..." He trailed off, looking troubled. "Maybe what? Maybe someone wanted you to disappear for reasons I don't understand yet." The possibility sent a chill down my spine. "I blamed myself completely," Thorne continued. "If I hadn't been such a bastard that night, Celeste never would have left the house. She'd still be alive, and you'd have grown up with the mother who loved you more than anything. You don't know that," I said quietly. Yes, I do. His voice was fierce with certainty. Every day for 18 years, I've carried the weight of knowing that my selfishness and cruelty killed the two people who should have mattered most to me. That's why I never got involved with anyone else. Why I built those walls around myself. I didn't deserve love after what I'd done. We sat in silence for a while, watching joggers and dog walkers pass by, both of us lost in our own thoughts. She loved you, I said finally. I know. And she would have loved me, more than anything in this world. So where does that leave us? I asked. The question that had been tearing me apart for days. Thorn turned to face me fully, and I saw my own anguish reflected in his eyes. I don't know, Brynn. I honestly don't know. 2 weeks after my world imploded, I was still trying to figure out how to put the pieces of my life back together when Ravenna Sterling knocked on my apartment door. I should have known she'd find me eventually. Thorn's business partner had always struck me as the type of woman who made it her business to know everything about everyone. I almost didn't answer the door. I'd been living like a hermit, surviving on delivery food and avoiding all human contact. But something about her persistent knocking suggested she wasn't going away. So I finally dragged myself off the couch and opened the door. Ravenna Sterling was everything I wasn't. Polished, sophisticated, and devastatingly beautiful in that ice queen way that some men found irresistible. She stood in my doorway wearing a designer coat that probably cost more than my yearly rent. Her perfectly styled blonde hair not showing a single strand out of place despite the February wind. "Hello, Brynn," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "May I come in?" "I'm not really up for company," I said, but she was already pushing past me into my tiny living room. "Oh, this is cozy," she said, looking around my apartment with barely concealed disdain. Very authentic. I closed the door and crossed my arms, not bothering to hide my annoyance. "What do you want, Ravenna? I heard about your little discovery," she said, settling herself on my couch like she owned the place. "About your unfortunate family connection to Thorn." The way she said it made my skin crawl. "If you came here to gloat." "Gloat?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, my dear, I came here to help." "Help with what?" "With your impossible situation, of course." She crossed her legs elegantly and studied me with calculating eyes. "You're in love with your stepfather, Brynn. Technically speaking, you've been committing incest for months." The words hit me like a slap, even though I'd been torturing myself with the same thoughts for weeks. "Don't look so shocked," Ravenna continued. "I'm not judging you. How could you have known? But the fact remains that your relationship with Thorn is morally reprehensible by any societal standard. Why are you here?" I asked again, my voice sharper this time. "Because I care about Thorn," she said, and for the first time, her expression showed something that might have been genuine emotion. "I've known him for 15 years, been his business partner for 10. I've watched him torture himself over Celeste's death, watched him build walls around his heart so high that no one could reach him." She paused, looking almost vulnerable for a moment. "Until you came along," she continued, and now there was definitely something darker in her tone. "Somehow you managed to do what no one else could. You got through his defenses. You made him care again. So it's killing him," she said bluntly. "The guilt of falling in love with his dead wife's daughter is destroying him. He's been a wreck since you left. Not sleeping, barely eating, making mistakes at work that could cost the company millions." I tried to ignore the pang of concern that shot through me. "That's not my problem anymore, isn't it?" Ravenna leaned forward, her blue eyes intense. "You love him, don't you? Even knowing what you know now, you still love him?" I didn't answer, but my silence was answer enough. "I thought so," she said with satisfaction, "which is why I'm here to offer you a solution." "What kind of solution?" "Leave New York," she said simply. "Leave the city, leave Thorn, leave this whole mess behind. I can arrange a position for you with one of our subsidiary companies. Excellent salary, full benefits, a chance to start over somewhere. No one knows your story." The offer was tempting. I had to admit, the idea of running away from all of this, of starting fresh somewhere else, had crossed my mind more than once over the past 2 weeks. "Where?" I asked, curious despite myself. "We have offices in Seattle." "Denver, Atlanta. Take your pick. I can have you relocated within the month. And, in return, you stay away from Thorn permanently. No contact, no messages, no attempts to see him. You let him heal and move on with his life. The way she said it, so matter of fact, so reasonable, made me want to throw something at her perfectly made-up face. You'd like that, wouldn't you? I said slowly, pieces of a puzzle starting to click together in my mind. You've been waiting for something like this to happen, an excuse to get me out of the picture. I don't know what you mean, she said, but something flickered in her eyes. You're in love with him, I realized. You've been in love with Thorn for years, haven't you? Waiting for your chance, watching him pine for his dead wife, and then I came along and ruined everything. Ravenna's mask slipped just enough for me to see the truth underneath. Thorn and I have a history that goes back long before you were even born. Little girl, we understand each other in ways you never could. Is that why you're so eager to get rid of me? Because you think if I'm gone, he'll finally turn to you. She stood up abruptly, her composure cracking. You have no idea what you're talking about, don't I? I stood up too, anger giving me strength I didn't know I had. You've been circling him like a vulture for years, waiting for the right moment to swoop in. But he never saw you that way, did he? Even after Celeste died, even when he was at his lowest. He never turned to you for comfort. Shut up, she hissed. That must have hurt, I continued, the words pouring out of me now. Watching him grieve for 18 years, knowing that he'd rather be alone than be with you. You little bitch, Ravenna snarled, all pretense of civility gone. You think you know him? You think what you had with him was real? You're a child playing dress-up in a woman's world. At least I didn't spend 15 years pathetically pining for a man who'll never love me back, I shot back. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. My cheek stung, and I could taste blood where I'd bitten my tongue. How dare you, she breathed, her face twisted with rage. You have no right to judge me, no right to waltz into our lives and destroy everything we've built. I didn't destroy anything, I said, touching my burning cheek. I didn't know who I was when I met him. But you know now, she said, regaining some of her composure. And you know that what you had with him was wrong, sick, unnatural. The words hit their mark because they echoed my own worst fears. Take the job, Brynn, she continued, her voice softening to something almost sympathetic. Let me help you start over. Let Thorn heal. It's the right thing to do for everyone involved. After she left, I sat in my living room for hours, turning her offer over in my mind. Part of me wanted to take it, wanted to run away from all the pain and confusion and start fresh somewhere else. It would be easier, cleaner, less complicated. But another part of me, a part that was growing stronger by the day, whispered that there was more to this story than I knew. Something about Ravenna's desperation to get me out of the picture felt wrong, felt calculated in a way that went beyond simple jealousy. And if there was one thing I'd learned from growing up without answers about my past, it was that running away from the truth never solved anything. After Ravenna's visit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Maybe it was the desperation in her voice when she offered me that job, or the way her carefully composed mask had slipped when I'd called her out on her feelings for Thorn. Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't just walk away without understanding what really happened the night my mother died. I started with the basics: public records, newspaper archives, anything I could find online about the accident. The official story was simple enough. Celeste Dalton Blackwood, 27, died in a single-car accident on Route 9 during a thunderstorm. Vehicle skidded on wet pavement, struck a tree, pronounced dead at the scene, emergency cesarean performed, but infant could not be saved. But the more I dug, the more questions I had. Why weren't there more details about the accident investigation? Why was the case closed so quickly? And most importantly, if I had survived that emergency cesarean, how had I ended up at an orphanage 3 states away with no record of how I got there? I decided to visit the hospital where I was supposedly born, St. Catherine's Medical Center in Westchester. It was a 2-hour train ride from the city, but I had nothing but time on my hands since I'd effectively quit my job by refusing to go back to Blackwood Enterprises. The records department at St. Catherine's was run by a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Rodriguez, who looked like she'd been there since the hospital was built. When I explained what I was looking for, her expression grew sympathetic but cautious. "Honey, records from that long ago aren't easy to access," she said, typing something into her computer. "And even if I could pull them, patient confidentiality laws. I'm the patient, I interrupted, showing her my driver's license. Well, the baby patient, Brynn Carlisle was my name at the orphanage, but my birth name would have been Baby Blackwood. She studied my ID, then looked back at her screen. Let me see what I can find. After several minutes of typing and frowning, she looked up at me with confusion. This is strange. I'm showing that Celeste Blackwood was admitted on February 15, 1996, and that an emergency cesarean was performed following the trauma from her accident. But what? There's no record of the infant's death. No death certificate? No morgue paperwork? Nothing. It's like the baby just disappeared from our system after the surgery. My heart started pounding. Is that normal? Absolutely not. Even if a baby dies during delivery, there are protocols, paperwork, legal requirements. We don't just lose track of patients, especially not. She trailed off, looking troubled. What? Dr. Martinez performed the cesarean. He was one of our best surgeons, very thorough with his documentation. It's not like him to leave gaps in the medical record. Is Dr. Martinez still around? Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. Retired about 5 years ago, but... She hesitated, then leaned forward conspiratorially. There was always talk about some irregularities in his final years. Nothing proven, but rumors about him taking payments for certain favors. The implication hit me like a punch to the gut. What kind of favors? Off-the-books procedures, falsified records, that sort of thing. She looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. Look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but there was an investigation into some missing infants around that time. Babies who were supposedly stillborn, but whose bodies were never properly accounted for. Missing infants. My voice came out as a whisper. The investigation was quietly dropped after a few months. Lack of evidence, they said. But the nurses who were here back then, some of them had suspicions. I left the hospital with more questions than answers, but with a growing certainty that my mother's death and my disappearance were connected to something much darker than a simple accident. My next stop was the orphanage where I'd grown up. St. Mary's Children's Home had closed down 3 years earlier, but I managed to track down Sister Catherine, the nun who'd been in charge of admissions during my time there. I found her at a small convent in Brooklyn, a frail woman in her 70s who remembered me immediately. "Little Brynn," she said with a sad smile. "You were such a quiet child, always asking questions about where you came from." "I'm still asking questions, sister," I said. "I need to know how I ended up at St. Mary's, who brought me there." Her expression grew troubled. That's something I've wondered about myself over the years." "What do you mean?" "Well, usually when babies come to us, there's paperwork, social services, court orders, that sort of thing. But with you," she shook her head, "a man brought you in the middle of the night, said he was from a private adoption agency that had fallen through. He had some documents, but looking back, I'm not sure they were legitimate." "What did this man look like?" "Middle-aged, well-dressed. He seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder like he was afraid someone might see him. He paid the home a substantial donation, much more than was necessary, and asked us not to ask too many questions about your background." "Did he give you a name?" "He said his name was Robert Smith. But even then, I suspected it was fake, and the adoption agency he claimed to represent. When I tried to follow up a few weeks later, I found out it didn't exist. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and it was an ugly one. Someone had paid to make me disappear, to hide the fact that I'd survived my mother's accident. But who and why? I spent the next few days digging deeper, following paper trails and making phone calls. I discovered that Dr. Martinez had purchased a house in Florida shortly after my mother's death, a house that cost significantly more than a hospital surgeon's salary should have allowed. I found records of the supposed adoption agency that had placed me, which existed for exactly 6 months before mysteriously dissolving. Most disturbing of all, I found evidence that several other infants had gone missing from area hospitals around the same time, all under similar circumstances. Babies who were supposedly stillborn, but whose bodies were never properly documented. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that my mother's death wasn't the simple accident everyone believed it to be, and somehow, Ravenna Sterling's name kept appearing in the periphery of my research, not directly connected, but always there, like a shadow at the edge of the picture. I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by printouts and notes, when my phone rang. It was Thorn. "Brynn," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I need to see you. There's something I have to tell you about Ravenna." "What about her?" "Not over the phone. Can you meet me tonight? It's important." Something in his tone made my stomach drop. "Thorn, what's going on?" "I think we've been played, Brynn. I think someone's been lying to us about everything." I met Thorn at a small coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from anywhere we might be recognized. When I walked in and saw him sitting in a corner booth, I was shocked by how much he'd deteriorated since our last meeting. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his usually impeccable appearance was disheveled in a way that spoke to deep exhaustion. "You look terrible," I said, as I slid into the seat across from him. "I feel worse," he admitted, attempting a weak smile. "Thank you for coming. What did you find out about Ravenna?" He pulled out a manila envelope and slid it across the table. "Financial records. I've been going through the company books with a fine-tooth comb since you left. Ravenna's been embezzling from Blackwood Enterprises for years." I opened the envelope and found pages of bank statements, transfer records, and accounting documents. Even with my limited financial knowledge, I could see the pattern: regular transfers to offshore accounts, falsified expense reports, money being funneled through shell companies. "How much?" I asked. "Close to $50 million over the past decade." His voice was flat, emotionless. "She's been brilliant about it, covering her tracks, making it look like legitimate business expenses if I hadn't been looking specifically for irregularities." "Why were you looking?" "Because of what you said about her being desperate to get you out of the picture. It got me thinking about her behavior over the years. How she always seemed to know things before I told her. How she had access to information she shouldn't have had." I studied the documents more carefully, noting dates and amounts. "Some of these transfers go back to 1996, I said slowly, "right around the time my mother died." "I know." Thorn's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Brynn, I think Ravenna might have had something to do with Celeste's death." The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too small. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about that night, about the fight Celeste and I had. Ravenna was the only person who knew about our problems. I'd confided in her about the stress in our marriage, about how Celeste felt neglected. So what if she used that information? What if she somehow orchestrated that final fight, knowing it would push Celeste to leave the house? The possibility was terrifying, but it made a horrible kind of sense. How could she have done that? I don't know yet, but I hired a private investigator to look into Celeste's death. He found some interesting things." Thorn pulled out another set of papers. "The accident report mentions that Celeste's car had been serviced the day before she died. Guess what garage she used?" I looked at the document he handed me. "Sterling Auto Repair, owned by Ravenna's cousin, the same cousin who conveniently died in a motorcycle accident 6 months after Celeste's death." My blood ran cold. "You think she sabotaged the car?" "I think it's possible, and I think she's been covering it up ever since, using stolen money to pay off anyone who might ask too many questions." I told him about my own investigation, the missing medical records, the suspicious circumstances around my placement at the orphanage, the pattern of other missing infants. As I spoke, I watched his face grow darker and more anguished. "She stole everything from us," he said when I finished. "Our child, our chance to grieve properly, 18 years of your life, all so she could have me to herself. We need proof," I said. "Real evidence. Not just suspicions." "I know. That's why I called you." He leaned forward intently. "I want to confront her, get her to confess, but I need your help." "What kind of help?" "She's been calling me constantly since you left, offering comfort, trying to position herself as the solution to my problems. I think if I play along, make her think she's finally getting what she's wanted all these years, she might let her guard down." The plan was risky, but it was our only shot at the truth. We agreed that Thorn would invite Ravenna to his penthouse apartment, and I would hide in his home office with a recording device, capturing whatever she might reveal. 2 nights later, I was crouched behind Thorn's desk, my heart pounding as I listened to him let Ravenna into his apartment. "Thorn, darling," I heard her say, her voice syrupy with false sympathy. "You look awful. You really need to take better care of yourself." "It's been difficult," he replied. playing his part perfectly, losing Brynn, finding out the truth about who she was. I don't know how to process any of it. Of course you don't. It's an impossible situation. I could hear them moving into the living room, their voices getting clearer as they approached the office. But you know I'm here for you. I've always been here. I know, and I'm grateful. I don't know what I would have done without your support all these years. You'll never have to find out, she said, and there was something possessive in her tone that made my skin crawl. They were quiet for a moment, and I wondered if Thorn was having second thoughts about our plan. Then he spoke again, his voice carefully controlled. Ravenna, can I ask you something? About Celeste? Of course. Did you ever think there was something suspicious about her accident? About the timing? I held my breath, waiting for her response. What do you mean? She asked, but I could hear the tension in her voice. I mean, she'd driven that route 1,000 times. She knew every curve, every turn, even in the rain, even upset. It seems strange that she'd lose control so completely. Accidents happen, Thorn, especially when people are emotional, not thinking clearly. I suppose you're right. He paused. And the baby. I've always wondered if there was more to that story, too. What kind of more? I hired an investigator, Thorn said quietly. He found some irregularities in the medical records, missing documentation, suspicious payments. The silence that followed was deafening when Ravenna finally spoke. Her voice was different, harder, more calculating. You hired an investigator without telling me. I needed answers, Ravenna. I needed to understand what really happened that night. And what did this investigator tell you? That someone paid Dr. Martinez to falsify the death certificate. That someone arranged for the baby to disappear instead of die. Thorn's voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying fury. That someone has been covering up the truth for 18 years. Another long silence. Then Ravenna laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. Oh, Thorn, she said, and now all pretense was gone from her voice. You always were too smart for your own good. It was you, he said. It wasn't a question. Of course it was me. The admission came so casually, so matter-of-factly that it took my breath away. Did you really think I was going to let that selfish little bitch destroy everything we could have together? You killed her. I freed you from her, Ravenna corrected. Celeste was holding you back, making you weak. She would have turned you into some domesticated house husband, content to settle for mediocrity. She was pregnant with my child, a child that would have tied you to her forever. But don't worry, darling. I made sure the baby survived. I couldn't quite bring myself to kill an innocent child, even if it was hers. I had to bite my hand to keep from crying out. The casual way she discussed my mother's murder, my own near death, was beyond horrifying. Where is she? Thorn demanded. Where is my daughter? Safe, anonymous, living a perfectly ordinary life far away from here. She'll never know who she really is or what she could have inherited. Ravenna's voice turned smug. I made sure of that. Hearing Ravenna confess to my mother's murder should have been the end of it. We had her on tape admitting to sabotaging Celeste's car, to bribing doctors, to orchestrating my disappearance. But Ravenna Sterling had spent 28 years perfecting her manipulations, and she wasn't done destroying lives yet. You know what the beautiful irony is, Thorn, she continued, her voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. You've been torturing yourself for 18 years over a lie. What lie? Thorn's voice was dangerous, barely controlled. The lie that Celeste was the perfect wife, the innocent victim. The lie that you were the only one to blame for what happened that night. I could hear movement in the living room, probably Thorn standing up, his patience finally snapping. Shut up, Ravenna. Oh, but this is the best part, she said, clearly enjoying herself. You want to know why Celeste was really running away that night? It wasn't because of your fight about work. It was because she'd finally worked up the courage to tell you the truth about her pregnancy. What truth? My blood turned to ice. I knew, somehow, before she even said the words. The baby wasn't yours, darling. Celeste had been having an affair with your best friend, Riker Ashford. She was carrying his child, not yours. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if my heart had stopped beating. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, about my connection to Thorn, crumbled in an instant. You're lying, Thorn said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Think about it. Why do you think Celeste was so desperate to leave that night? Why was she so emotional, so determined to get away from you? She'd finally realized she couldn't keep lying about the baby's paternity, and she was terrified of your reaction. That's impossible. Celeste wouldn't what? Cheat on her emotionally absent husband with a man who actually paid attention to her? A man who was there when you weren't. Ravenna's laughter was cruel. Oh, Thorn, you really are naive. I thought back to everything Thorn had told me about my mother, about their marriage, about the problems they'd been having. Celeste had felt neglected, lonely, desperate for connection, and Riker Ashford. I remembered Thorn mentioning him before, his business partner in the early days, his closest friend. When did it start? Thorn asked quietly. About 6 months before she died, you were so busy with that merger. Remember, working 18-hour days, coming home exhausted, barely speaking to your wife. Riker started stopping by to check on her, being the friend and confidant that you couldn't be bothered to be. And you knew about this. I suspected. I kept an eye on them, took some pictures, gathered evidence. I was planning to tell you eventually, but then Celeste got pregnant and everything became more complicated. I was reeling, trying to process what this meant. If Ravenna was telling the truth, then Thorn wasn't my stepfather. We had no blood relation at all. The thing that had torn us apart, the moral impossibility of our relationship, was based on a lie, but that also meant that everything I'd believed about my identity was wrong. Thorn hadn't been my mother's husband when she got pregnant with me. The man I'd fallen in love with was just a man my mother had been married to. Yes, but not my father in any sense of the word. So you see, Ravenna continued, you've been carrying guilt over a child that was never yours to begin with. Isn't that delicious? All these years of self-flagellation over losing your wife and daughter, when the truth is, that little brat was never your responsibility. Stop, Thorn said, his voice raw. Just stop. But I'm not finished. The best part is still coming. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but in the silence of the apartment, I could still hear every word. Brynn doesn't know, does she? She still thinks she's your stepdaughter. She's probably out there somewhere torturing herself over your impossible love affair, believing she's some kind of pervert for falling for her dead mother's husband. That's when I couldn't stay hidden any longer. The cruelty in her voice, the casual way she discussed my pain, broke something inside me. I stood up from behind the desk and walked into the living room. Actually, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, I'm right here. Ravenna spun around, her face going white. What are you doing here? Recording every word you've said. I held up my phone, still running the voice memo app, including your confession to murdering my mother, for the first time since I'd known her. Ravenna Sterling looked genuinely afraid. You little bitch, you've been eavesdropping. On a murderer, yeah, I have. I looked at Thorn, who was staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. Hi, Thorn. Brynn, he breathed. How long have you been here? Long enough? I turned back to Ravenna, who was backing toward the door. So Riker Ashford was my biological father. It doesn't matter now, she said quickly. He's been dead for years. Motorcycle accident in 2010. How convenient for you, I said. No loose ends to tie up. You can't prove anything, Ravenna said, but she was starting to sound desperate. It's your word against mine. Actually, it's your confession against you. I waved my phone. I've got everything recorded. The murder, the cover-up, the embezzlement Thorn discovered. I think that's more than enough for the police. Ravenna's eyes darted between Thorn and me, calculating her options. You don't understand, she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. I did it for love. I've loved Thorn for 15 years. Everything I did was to protect him, to free him from people who would hurt him. You killed my mother, I said flatly. I saved him from a cheating wife who would have destroyed him when the truth came out. You stole 18 years of my life. I gave you a better life than you would have had. Do you think Thorn would have wanted to raise another man's bastard? The slap came before I even realized I was moving. My hand connected with her cheek so hard that she stumbled backward. Don't you ever call me that again, I said, my voice deadly quiet. Ravenna touched her reddening cheek, her eyes blazing with hatred. You're just like your mother, she spat. A selfish little whore who thinks she can take whatever she wants. This time it was Thorn who moved, crossing the room in 2 quick strides and grabbing Ravenna by the arm. "Get out," he said, his voice ice cold. "Get out before I do something I'll regret." "Thorn, please," she tried one last time. "We can work this out. We can—" "The police are already on their way," I lied smoothly. "I called them before I came upstairs." That broke her. Ravenna wrenched free from Thorn's grip and ran for the door, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood floor after she left. Thorn and I stood in the sudden silence of his apartment, both of us trying to process what had just happened. "So," I said finally, "I'm not your stepdaughter." "No," he said quietly, "you're not. And Riker Ashford was my real father. Apparently." I walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. "Do you think she was telling the truth about my mother's affair?" Thorn was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally, "but it would explain some things. Celeste's behavior in those last few months, her reluctance to discuss the pregnancy, the way she seemed to be hiding something." "Are you angry?" I asked. "About the affair." "I don't know what I am anymore," he admitted, relieved, maybe, if it's true. "Then I wasn't really betrayed, and you and I—" He trailed off. "We're not related," I finished. "No, we're not." 6 months later, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the delicate lace sleeves of my wedding dress. It was simple, but elegant. Ivory silk, with tiny pearl buttons down the back, exactly the kind of dress I'd dreamed about as a little girl in the orphanage. The same medallion that had started this whole journey hung around my neck, but now it felt like a blessing instead of a curse. Ravenna Sterling was serving a life sentence for first-degree murder, conspiracy, embezzlement, and a dozen other charges. The recording I'd made that night in Thorn's apartment had been more than enough evidence to convict her. During the trial, even more of her crimes had come to light. The bribes she'd paid, the people she'd intimidated into silence, the elaborate web of lies she'd woven to keep the truth buried. The weeks following her arrest had been a whirlwind of investigations, media attention, and legal proceedings. But through it all, Thorn and I had found our way back to each other. The revelation that we weren't related, that our love wasn't the impossible thing we'd believed it to be, had lifted a weight from both our hearts that we'd almost forgotten how to live without. It wasn't easy at first. We'd both been so damaged by the discovery of our supposed family connection that it took time to trust our feelings again. But slowly, carefully, we'd rebuilt what Ravenna had tried to destroy, and this time, it was based on complete honesty and truth. The most amazing discovery had come 2 months after Ravenna's confession. When Thorn's lawyer contacted us about some documents that had been found in a safety deposit box, Celeste had left them there with instructions to be opened only in the event of her death. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in my mother's careful handwriting. Letters to me, to Thorn, to the family she'd hoped we could become together. In them, she'd told the complete truth about her affair with Riker, about her guilt and shame, but also about her love for Thorn and her hopes for the future. The letter that changed everything was the one addressed to both Thorn and me. "My darling Thorn and my precious daughter. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've somehow found each other. I pray that if this day ever comes, you'll both be able to forgive me for the lies I told and the pain I caused. Thorn, the baby I'm carrying isn't yours, and I'm so sorry for letting you believe she was." During our separation last year, when we were both so lost and hurting, I found comfort with Riker. It was wrong, and it only lasted a few weeks, but it resulted in this pregnancy. I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was terrified of losing you. You were the best man I'd ever known, and I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing you again. When I realized I was pregnant, I ended things with Riker immediately and came back to you, hoping we could build our family on the foundation of our renewed love. But I've realized that love built on lies isn't love at all. That's why I've written these letters, and why I'm finally going to tell you the truth about everything, including the baby's parentage. If something happens to me before I can have this conversation, I want you both to know that my greatest wish is for you to find happiness. Whether together or apart, Thorn, you are not responsible for this child. But you're the only man I'd trust to love her if something happened to me and to my daughter. If you ever read this, please know that you were conceived in a moment of weakness, but carried with overwhelming love. There is no blood relation between you and Thorn. If fate brings you together and you find love with each other, there is nothing wrong with that, nothing immoral or shameful. You would have my blessing from beyond, and my hope that you can find the happiness that circumstances prevented your father and me from achieving. Love without guilt, love without shame, love with my eternal blessing. All my love. Celeste. Reading those words had been like receiving permission to breathe again. My mother, the woman I'd never known but had always carried in my heart, was telling us that our love was not only acceptable but blessed. She'd given us the gift of freedom from the guilt that had nearly destroyed us. Now, on my wedding day, I felt her presence so strongly it was like she was standing right beside me. Thorn and I had decided to get married at the same location where he'd proposed to Celeste 25 years earlier. A beautiful garden overlooking the Hudson River. But this time, instead of trying to replace her memory, we were including her in our celebration. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called. Thorn appeared in the doorway, devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, carrying a framed photograph in his hands. "You look incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony," I protested, but I was smiling. "I had to bring you this." He held up the photograph, a beautiful portrait of Celeste, radiant and smiling, that had been taken just weeks before her death. I thought maybe you'd like to carry it with you today, so she can be part of this." Tears sprang to my eyes, but they were happy tears. "That's perfect." He came closer, setting the photograph carefully on my dresser and taking my hands in his. "Brynn, are you sure about this? Are you sure you want to marry a man who's old enough to be your father and comes with more baggage than an airport?" I laughed, reaching up to cup his face. "I'm sure I want to marry the man who taught me what real love feels like. The man who showed me that I'm worth fighting for. The man who makes me feel like I finally have a family. Even though our story is so complicated that people will probably write soap operas about it. Especially because of that," I said. "Our story proves that love can survive anything. Lies, betrayal, even murder. It proves that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the darkest places. I love you, Brynn Carlisle. I love you too, Thorn Blackwood. And in about an hour, I'm going to love you as your wife." The ceremony was small and intimate, just a handful of close friends and the minister. But as I walked down the aisle carrying Celeste's photograph, I felt like she was there with us, guiding me toward the man who'd been meant for me all along. When I reached Thorn, he was crying. So was I. So was pretty much everyone there, because our story, as twisted and tragic as it had been, was ultimately a story about love conquering everything. "Sometimes," I said during my vows, reading from the letter I'd written the night before, "the universe has to break us completely before it can put us back together in the right way. Sometimes we have to lose everything we think we want to find everything we actually need. And sometimes love has to travel through generations to find its way home." I looked out at our small gathering, then at the photograph of my mother sitting on the altar beside us. Celeste Dalton gave me life, but she also gave me something more precious than that. She gave me her blessing to love the man who was always meant to be mine. She taught me that love doesn't follow rules or timelines or social expectations. Love just is. After we exchanged rings and kissed as husband and wife, Thorn and I visited Celeste's grave. We told her about our happiness, about the company we were building together, about our plans for the future. I swear I felt her approval in the warm breeze that rustled through the trees. Today, 2 years later, our daughter Celeste Brynn Blackwood is taking her first steps, and I can see so much of her grandmother in her bright eyes and determined spirit. Sometimes I catch Thorn watching our daughter with wonder, like he can't quite believe he gets to be part of something so beautiful after all the pain he endured. This is my story. The story of how I learned that family isn't always about blood, that love doesn't always follow the rules, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the greatest tragedies. My mother's love guided me to Thorn, and Thorn's love gave me the family I'd always dreamed of. The medallion still hangs around my neck, but now it's a symbol of connection rather than mystery. It connects me to a mother I never knew, but who loved me enough to ensure my happiness even from beyond the grave.